Good afternoon, everyone, and it's great to see so many of you here, especially to see so many students. I think that's a testament to you, Steve. This might be the biggest crowd we've had for one of the Jean Monnet lectures, so I think it speaks to...
No, it's because I'm the only unionist in the village, that's why.
Could be that too, could be that too. But I suppose what it does do is maybe signal an interest, or at least a curiosity in what you're going to talk about today. So Steve is... Dr. Steve Aiken is a member of the Legislative Assembly in Northern Ireland. He was previously Chief Executive of the British Irish Chamber of Commerce, and he's had a very long and distinguished career in the Royal Navy as well. Steve is also the Chief Whip of the Ulster Unionist Party, and he's the Brexit and Finance spokesperson for the party. So there really is no better man to talk to us about this subject today. I think the events of recent days have really demonstrated the complexities and the sensitivities of the Brexit debate. And at the heart of all those negotiations, there's the backstop, and there's the confusion and the misunderstanding, I think, about the unionist position on the backstop. So I warmly welcome Steve to UCC today. We've met previously a few times at other events, and I've always been impressed by his moderation and by his good sense, but perhaps more especially by his willingness to engage. And I'd respectfully suggest that we don't often hear enough from unionism on this side of the border, maybe perhaps even more so this far in the deep south. And I think that maybe feeds a historic misunderstanding, which we're all the lesser for. So this lecture is about Brexit, but it's also about looking forward and about how it's, I guess, maybe perhaps challenging us to think about future relationships and how they might be managed after Brexit. Because there's a lot to be protected, not just relationships and institutions, but I think friendships as well. So in that spirit of friendship, Steve, you're very welcome to UCC today, and we very much look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Sorry, the reason I stood up is to mention the Jean Monnet Erasmus Plus programme, which is sponsoring today's event. So I'd just like to put that on the record before we start.
Okay, cheers. Thank you very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for coming to come and listen to me on this absolutely wonderful day here in Cork. And just looking outside and looking at the sort of the sunshine, and bearing in mind when I'm normally in Cork and when the sun is shining, I'm not to be found in a lecture theatre. I would normally be sitting in one of the numerous establishments quaffing some of Cork's finest ale just to enjoy myself a bit. The title of my talk is The Day After. And what I want to do is I want to talk about building and enduring relationships for these islands. As I said, it's a pleasure to be back here in Cork, and I am a frequent visitor, both as a tourist and in my previous guise when I was the Chief Executive of the British Irish Chamber of Commerce. And I'll talk a bit about that later on. And I'm very pleased you invited me to speak here today. I remember asking some time ago before I made my first speech in Cork, and somebody said ABCD. And I said, what the heck's ABCD? And he says, it's simple. It's about but Cork's different. You will notice that I do an absolutely appalling Cork accent. But I think the one thing we need to do is talk about our concerns about Brexit and the impact it's had on the future relationships across these islands. One of the many curses of trying to talk about the B word is how we can keep up with the endless, and I say post-modern day Shakespearean tragedy that is the Conservative Party's 40-year civil war over Europe. I've scoped, rescoped and rewritten the introduction of my remarks at least several times in the last week, or at least even in the last 24 hours. But I shall hopefully, with your indulgence, skip over much of the recent history to future cast what I call as the day after. Don't ask me when it's going to be, but there will be a day after. When, regardless of the machinations now ongoing, we will have to rebuild, as I say, all our relationships within Northern Ireland, between North and South on this island, across the Irish Sea, and how we manage to maintain a non-rancorous relationship with the EU going forward. And while many are trying to talk about de-dramatising Brexit, the rhetoric of the last few days from Prime Ministers, Foreign Ministers, European Presidents, ex-Northern Ireland First Ministers, and would-be leaders of the DUP has only served to further ratchet up tensions. Whether it is the backstop or the backstop within the backstop, it is incontrovertible that this entire sorry state of affairs has helped destabilise relations across these islands, just when the need for understanding has never been greater. I'm also conscious that after the other illustrious speakers in the Jean Monnet lecture series, see, got a plug in there, got that, right? Including Tony Connolly, Matt O'Toole and Dennis McShane, amongst others, that they're much better qualified to talk about the modalities of Brexit. Perhaps it would be useful to get a political and a unionist political perspective as well. But first, a health warning from one, I would suggest, probably the only unionist in the village today. I was and am a Remainer, and would still be if the vote was taken again. So my views throughout this presentation are coloured by that fact. But for the sake of balance later on, I'll try and explain the DUP perspective. That's for a degree of intellectual challenge and tautology of thought if you ever particularly wanted to do it. But suffice to say, in the main, it's a considerable variance to mine and my own party. The view of our party, the Ulster Unionist Party, is simple. We believe in the Union because it is the best for all of the people of Northern Ireland, for the United Kingdom, and also for everybody across these islands. A strong relationship, north, south, east and west, that is built on the foundation of the Belfast Agreement, an agreement that our party nearly self-immolated on, is a relationship with the bedrock which has consent as its principle. As a party, we campaigned to remain, not because we saw the EU as a paragon of efficiency and democracy. Indeed, as many of us who've worked there can attest, it is far from that, but because, on balance, it was best for us all. We also understood that a no vote would have placed the border question back firmly on the political agenda. Right now, we do not want to see any borders beyond what are here today. Again, this transcends the issues of economics, but discussions around the backstop and so-called special status are seen by us, and indeed by most political parties, as increasingly matters pertaining to sovereignty. When the Taoiseach and the Tánaiste talk about special status for Northern Ireland, they are talking to all our community in the language of Sinn Féin. No matter which way you attempt to square it, any future divergence of Great Britain from Northern Ireland, with Northern Ireland under a quasi-European authority subject to the European Court of Justice, without any local representation, does clearly represent a challenge to the principle of consent. Far from a win-win, it will represent a lose-lose scenario, not just for Northern Ireland, but for everybody on these islands. We would also like all of the UK to remain in some form of whatever, call it whatever you want, customs union, because we consider this to be the most pragmatic answer to Brexit. We should not be in a zero-sum game, even though we are. And we are trying to minimise the downside to leaving the EU. I'm also an unapologetic, and because I'm an august academic institution, I won't have to explain the definition, liberal institutionalist. I believe in the power of international organisations and globalisation. Indeed, it may surprise some, but I represent a strong unionist tradition that not only positively wants good and enduring relations with the Irish Republic, we believe that a strong and successful Ireland is good for all of us, from Ringaskiddy to Larne and beyond. It's not just that I and a million other people like me are very happy with our British status quo, and that's not likely ever to change. Call it a unionism for the 21st century, rather than some would suspect or advocate for the 17th. As I have said, our party's position was that on balance, we'd be better off in the EU. However, now, because we're Democrats and believe in the Union, we must follow the democratic will of the United Kingdom, and as such, we're leaving, no matter how regrettable it is. And we need the best deal as possible, a deal that minimises the downsides. And to be honest, I haven't found any potential upsides yet. To this informed audience, I'll not attempt to rehash the historical context and the reasoning behind the Brexit vote. But at this point, I'd like to commend to this audience, if you haven't read it already, Sir Ivor Rogers' the UK former ambassador to the EU's recent Cambridge lecture. It's very, very good and very clear. I'm not a student of the Jacobins, but the analogy he uses to the current crop of ideologues and the revolutionary zeal with which they're pursuing a purist break from the EU is frighteningly worrying. Also, as a proud member of that ever-narrowing middle ground, it's this ideological tone of British politics that is, quite frankly, so un-British. So, on that cheery note, I want to talk about where we are now, the challenges that Brexit brings to relations within the UK, in the macro sense with the EU26, within the micro sense, and I'm not being rude about this, with the EU1, Ireland, and within Northern Ireland. And then I'd like to preface a few remarks about a new approach for a uniting kingdom as a framework to go back to an appropriate relationship across these islands and beyond. And as the former EU president said recently in Oxford, to achieve a future relationship between us without rancour. Now, within the UK, the Brexit referendum, regardless of your perspectives on whether it was the inevitable or not, was a vote about many things. It was not just a revolt of Middle England against the metropolitan elite. It tapped into a very real sense of what the British people saw as their sense of place, of identity, and their understanding. A stance of ourselves separate from a wider European ideal. Whereas, and I'm presuming we are nearly all Europeans because I consider myself a European, whereas for many of us Europeans, we saw in the EU, in my opinion rightly, as a construct that has preserved the peace and security of the continent since the 1950s. And despite some of its well-documented democratic deficits, it was the best game in town. But for Britons, it was always sold as an economic union to pull the United Kingdom out of the doldrums of the failing post-industrial age. It would also be very easy to ascribe the no vote to a white, ageing, undereducated demographic, but this was just not so. In Birmingham, Leicester, Wales, the North East and West, a large swathe of traditional and new Britons voted together to leave. Many in Labour heartlands. The disaffection with the European project is more widely rooted than many of us would wish. And while a second referendum is unlikely but not impossible, the result may well indeed be the same. But now, what has happened is that there is a desire, regardless of outcome, for the political class to show some leadership and just get on with Brexit. Sadly, for such an important issue, many people are just fed up and quite frankly bored with the discourse emanating from the Whitehall village. And behind the scenes, both Labour and the Conservatives are aware that the electorate are in no mood to reward any politicians at the moment. Another election could result in a similar sort of minority or small majority government. So across the United Kingdom at the moment, there is no consensus about the future. The fractious relationship between the Conservative Party and its supporters is mirrored within the Labour Party. In Scotland, there is now a merging of the debate on Europe with future questions about independence. In Wales, surprisingly, there's a continued Euroscepticism against the acknowledged importance of the EU to the Welsh economy, and to Northern Ireland, where Brexit, and I wish to be very careful in my language here, has placed the constitutional question back on the table. It has also on many levels awakened debate about regionalism, the subsidiarity of power and accountability, on English national identity, and the decentralisation of power away from the South East. Owen Cowan-Jones, the First Minister of Wales, has been one of the most clear-sighted leaders, who has stated on several occasions that Brexit has fundamentally changed the relationship between the devolved administrations in Westminster. The ongoing Supreme Court challenge brought by the Scottish Government around how powers repatriated from Brussels will be dealt with, and particularly how the Sewell Convention now seems to have been completely ignored by Westminster, has brought around another series of challenges, fostering resentment, not only amongst the SNP, but pro-union Scots as well. In London, we see that the Mayor has been determinedly pushing for differing powers around migration. In Manchester and the West Country, there's a growing demand for greater powers to manage local issues. The demand for subsidiarity, the most EU of phrases, is alive and growing across the United Kingdom. All of these issues have been energised by the Brexit debate. I've also spent quite a lot of time in the EU, meeting many ministers and political parties from Warsaw, Berlin, Brussels, and across the spectrum. And I've been struck by three things that are often ignored in the discourse in the United Kingdom. The first is that the EU26, in varying degrees, are going to miss the United Kingdom. But we Brits have always been seen as reluctant Europeans, and the feeling is if you wish to go, go. But please, keep your army and your air force in the Baltics and along the Black Sea. Keep your navy keeping pressure on Putin. Please keep your economy open to our goods and people. Please help us deal with security issues in the Middle East. Help with our diplomatic efforts. Help finance us through the City of London. Give us access to your globally leading R&D. And by the way, can we make sure we have the cheque for your 40 billion before you go, please? So if you're going, don't be a stranger and please forward the cheque as quickly as possible. Secondly, the EU has lots of problems which we're barely dealing with. We don't need more to worry about. Please just get that deal so you can agree on it and get onto the future. And also your sense of good luck with dealing with the US and China. We're struggling to get equitable deals, so how do you hope to do so? So don't be too hopeful of us having the capacity to deal with your issues. Thirdly, we're at an inflection point in history. Unfortunately, Brexit has just added to the disruption, but to navigate our way through it, we need to have a degree of pragmatic realism in Europe. And unfortunately, the United Kingdom used to be the country that provided that pragmatic realism, but you've become all ideological. Where's the realistic leadership going to come from? So, oh you Brits, can you still remember your European as well as your Atlanticist credentials and continue to advocate for Europe that you so eloquently pursued for the last 7 decades before being sidetracked by your ideologically conflict at the moment? From my perspective, and unfortunately not as often portrayed by the British media, the UK was in fact very influential in Europe. The single market was espoused and championed by that arch-European, Margaret Thatcher, and that the common regulatory framework that allows Airbus, Jaguar, Land Rover, Nissan, BMW, etc., 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 has made the United Kingdom the centre of modern lean manufacturing. The fact that that is a British construct, and we will be following it in any circumstances, but now as a rule taker rather than a rule maker. Also, we look at the needs of collective European security, including Britain. Whether you ascribe to Bazan's Copenhagen School of Securitization or not, these are self-evident. As we shift from the US's rather fleeting moment of unipolarity to an increasingly uncertain world of realist hegemonic power transition. See, told you, talking to university, can do that. The UK needs as wide a strategic network of influence as it can. And it should be starting across the channels. It should be starting across the English Channel and St George's Channel. Those links should be kept going and open. Curiously, whenever I debate with the urgists, and that's not something you particularly like to do, it's like debating with Sinn Féin and the DUP. It's a completely nihilistic way of spending an afternoon if you've ever done one. I have to point out that the UK has sought strategic balancing for centuries. We have never gone it alone since 1776. And the first thing we have always sought to do is to seek an in back into Europe. It is also worth noting, as has been pointed out to me by Estonian, Polish, Dutch, Danish and even the French, that European security without the UK is fundamentally weakened, and without British enablers, much of the European capability is, in military terms, fixed and only marginally useful. So there's a very strong case for wide-ranging continued UK-EU26 relationship, and I hope that's self-evident. I also now have to make a declaration as the first Chief Executive of the British Irish Chamber of Commerce that I have a strong personal interest in making the East-West dimension of our relationship work. I was part of those discussions with Dublin and London that started changing the dialogue between us from about 10 square feet of North Belfast to being about the €1 billion a week's worth of trade that went back and forth across the Irish Sea. And I think the latest trade figures put it somewhere around about €65 billion. And that indeed London and Dublin had far more in common, and not just the property prices, with each other, and that a deep relationship across the Irish Sea would help improvements for all. I learned the then indivisibility of our agribusiness. The reason why the UK was Ireland's biggest export market for agriculture, and Ireland was the same for the UK, was it was all the same stuff. The same goods travelling many times across seamless borders on the same trucks from the same warehouses sold in the same supermarket chains. I was also struck, now being a seasoned politician of almost 3 years, how much importance needs to be placed on relations. As a party, we look nostalgically back to the Kenny Flanagan era of relationships, and when British and Irish politicians and officials were not only in first name terms, they actually regularly talked to each other rather than past each other. And generally speaking, it was around a pint, not on Twitter or on the Today programme. As a unionist Ulsterman, British and Irishman, and erstwhile European, I thought that being presented to Her Majesty and the President of Ireland in Windsor Castle in 2014 was the start of a new era. Unfortunately, the chilling of relations and use of the megaphone rather than the pint has undermined not just the UK's perspective of Ireland, but also, I strongly suspect, of Ireland's view of Britain. It is now telling that the Tánaiste occupies a space in the British red top land similar to that of Jacques Delors of the up yours Dolores fame. This is neither respectful or helpful, but can in the circumstances for many be understood. I think one of the main problems that I've seen in Britain, that when we thought of the EU, we looked east. To many people in England in particular, when they thought about Ireland at all, it wasn't in a European context. Equally in Ireland, and especially in and around the M50, there's been an identification with London, Manchester and Liverpool, and a disconnect with what was actually happening in the heartlands of Britain, or for that matter, what was going on in Belfast. I was struck by a conversation by an Irish minister during the Brexit referendum, and Paul and I will know who the person is, that when they were visiting the Irish diaspora in Manchester, there was nearly as many Leave as Remain voters there. And among the 600,000 odd Irish born in GB, there was a marked homogeneity of views with those they lived among. And that we should have better understood what the other was thinking. And I say the dialogue of the megaphone between Dublin and London, with ministers and senior politicians various, seemingly talking in sound bites for the media outlets, has further harmed relations. While the obvious ignorance of many an MP or government minister from the shires over the exact nature of the border has played well into accepted stereotypes, mine included, equally patrician European tones from the Irish side have reinforced a view that Ireland is seeking to tweak the lion's tail rather than doing what's best for all of us. I have also heard many comments from across the British political spectrum referring to the UK's more generous terms of the Irish bailout in 2010, terms that were much more generous than those provided by the EU, and that such largesse and consequence, giving altruistic by the British Exchequer, is never like to be forthcoming again. And again, in any sense, as some political commentators, including Sinn Féin, seem to think if there was a united Ireland, the United Kingdom would continue to fit the bill for a further 50 years, you can clearly forget about that. The bill has been paid in full. Which brings us to Northern Ireland. I've studiously ignored the Northern Ireland political impasse until now. And for those of you whose eyes glaze over, and I can see that as soon as I mentioned the word Northern Ireland, the opportunity, and you want to use the opportunity to check your Twitter accounts every time the dreary steeples of Northern Ireland are mentioned, now's your chance. Mary, you wrote quite clearly, the politicisation of the EU and Brexit is evident in Northern Ireland, and Brexit has produced a polarising effect. Bears in forests, prelates in Rome, etc. Very definitely. Brexit has created very clearly two unwelcome dynamics around Northern Ireland. The first, it has woken the sleeping dragon of a border poll in a way that pre-referendum was so far away in the future that it was only of interest to the Republican fringes and academics seeking a reason for publishing impenetrable papers of somewhat dubious economic or any other veracity. That even the discussion around a border poll has now become mainstream has conflated with the idea of Northern Ireland voting to remain. Indeed, the number of times I have been informed of the fact that unionists who voted Remain are now pro-United Ireland makes me to believe that I must be living in Ballyclare in a parallel orange-tinted universe. This is linked to the second unwelcome dynamic. Northern Ireland is not yet mature enough to effectively manage its democratic processes itself. The last decade of DUP Sinn Féin government has shown the perverting of the intent of the Belfast Agreement through St Andrews, Stormont House et al., has resulted not in a demonstrably clear example of devolved democracy, but a Frankenstein of polarity that can't even run a renewable heating scheme. Or for that case, civil servants who forgot to take minutes of every meeting that they happen to do as well. The sad fact for me, as a strong believer in devolution, is that the political process in Northern Ireland needs the firm hand and full-time interest of the British and Irish governments. Quite frankly, the children can't be left to play with the train set alone. Earlier I promised to give a DUP perspective, and it's perhaps appropriate right now to look across the unionist fence to give my personal views and where I think they're at. First up, they're a party in turmoil, and dependent on what media source you believe, it's either torn by internal dissent, ripe for a leadership change, holding the Prime Minister to her word, or about to collapse the government. This is all happening while a near daily tale of possible, I use the word possible, just in case, legally reasons, institutionalised corruption, ruled by SPAD, MPs bringing Parliament into disrepute, an adherence to socially conservative views, and a failure to bring the devolved administration back onto operation continues. The DUP, like Sinn Féin, are a party of tactics, of protest, rather than government. And they're probably the most successful election machines on this island. They both do this by playing on fear. Fear of or against the other. They are symbiotic or parasitic, depending on your points of view. And thanks to St Andrews, can always rely on the galvanising of their polarised electorate in the opposition to each other. It is telling that of the overall electorate in Northern Ireland of 1.25 million in the 2017 Assembly elections, 28% voted for Sinn Féin, 28% voted for the DUP, 39% voted for us nice, fluffy, middle-of-the-road type people, and 35% roughly didn't bother voting at all. This also, if you consider the figures within the context of the overall electorate, shows that Sinn Féin and DUP represent retrospectively 18% each of the electorate. That is hardly a resounding demonstration of electoral power. But because of the requirement to have a mandatory rather than a voluntary executive, deadlock is institutionalised. The DUP, like Sinn Féin, in many ways define themselves by opposition. Indeed, that is why I've cautioned many Conservative MPs against believing the DUP are bluffing about pulling down Theresa May. Quite frankly, they would spin that as being a dying in the ditch for the Union. And it's a sad reality that they wouldn't be severely punished at the polls for it. Not while the likes of Sinn Féin use every election as a pre-border poll abstentionist plebiscite. For those of us like myself who remember DUP ministers supporting the EU less than a few years ago, and as the Chief Executive of the British Irish Chamber of Commerce, I had Arlene Foster at an event that I had where she was extolling the virtues of the EU. And did I try and find that clip? Could I find it? I couldn't. So, anybody can find it, please forward it to me. I would love it. Ironically, it appears that the DUP supported a leave vote on the basis that it wasn't going to happen. Privately, many of their members have expressed shock about what has happened, all the time publicly trying to spin what a great success it's going to be. It's also worth noting that the centre of gravity of the party was always Stormont. Westminster was used as a place to put out to pasture the popular, but charitably put, less mainstream players. A further law of unintended consequence has been the failure to restore the executive of Northern Ireland, as that it's empowered the Brexit ideological wing of the DUP. All you have to do is listen to the news clips every evening and listen to who's speaking. But for me, the DUP's biggest and most shameful failure as so-called unionists has been ceding of every strategic advantage to Sinn Féin, who had nothing to do except Mrs Foster's gift that keeps on giving. Suffice to say, Brexit has horribly paralysed Northern Ireland politics, but as mentioned above, has also served as a catalyst to undermine East-West relations. But how do we get to the next day? How do we get to the day after tomorrow? Despite all the rhetoric, so one of the things I just want to talk about is appreciate where the United Kingdom is now. And despite all the rhetoric, it's worth noting that the United Kingdom is the 6th largest economy in the world. It's got a GDP of approaching 3 trillion. It's a member of the P5. It's a significant power. And along with Turkey and Ireland, it's the only countries in Europe where the population is actually rising. So that means over the next couple of decades, the GDP of Ireland, of Turkey, and the United Kingdom is going to go up. The United Kingdom is recognised as the world's #1 soft power. It's one of the largest it's the 9th largest global manufacturer. It's one of the global powers in the services sector. And in short, it is a globalised trading nation, integrated, interconnected, and interdependent with the international system. And despite them leaving the EU, after the 29th of March next year, that will still be most of the case. However, the EU will continue to be one of the 3 largest trading blocs and will remain our most important global market. And its continued success is vital for our own security and economic well-being. We need each other. We also need to recognise internally that the United Kingdom, things cannot remain as they are. While hopefully unlikely, the so-called Conservative and Unionist Party could preside over the breakup of Mrs May's precious union. Add to that and the sad reality that within the decade, the new Elizabethan era will regrettably and inevitably come to an end. This will cause a considerable degree of introspection and re-evaluation of what it even means to be a subject in the United Kingdom. Debates in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland and the regions aren't going away. will continue to grow, and unless the issues of real devolution, identity and local democracy are addressed, I can envisage a wide variety of unpalatable outcomes if a new consensus cannot be agreed upon. So maybe it's time for a uniting kingdom. Our nation does not have a written constitution, rather a set of precedents, built upon since 1215, and a body of law, culture and history that makes it difficult to accurately define the rights and national and regional settlement that we've evolved into. It is paradoxical that it was only with the advent of the EEC and then the EU that much thought had actually been given to how we actually define ourselves by our laws. Or more specifically, those laws and regulations that we were happy, inverted commas, ish, derogate to the European process. Equally, it can be argued that the Belfast Agreement in 1998 was the first piece of formal constitutional legislation that had actually recognised some of these competing priorities. The durability and importance of the Belfast Agreement, having been laid out in international treaty, underpinned by the overriding principle of consent, demonstrates its strength. Why else would the current backstop and backstop about a backstop or backstop about a backstop about a backstop debate be of such fundamental, if critical, importance? But it is in the strands of the Belfast Agreement that I see a framework for a new relationship across all of the United Kingdom and beyond. The repatriation of powers from the EU to the evolved regions raises a significant opportunity to consider how subsidiarity of powers is executed, both between Westminster and the devolved assemblies and Parliament, and between the devolved administrations themselves. This might sound like a strand from the 1998 agreement for all of the United Kingdom rather than just for Northern Ireland, and it is. We also have to have formalised relationships between the component parts of the United Kingdom as well as between Westminster and the regional capitals. Again, this sounds like another strand of the Good Friday Agreement. Indeed, maybe this will lead to another approach such as co-federalism. A Good Friday Agreement for the UK, possibly. But this brings about an additional possibility. If this debate around Brexit has taught us anything, it is the need to refresh the relationships across these islands. Again, when we look at the 98 agreement, we can see the importance placed in East-West relations. And we would like to see, as the dust settles, that a more codified and formalised relationship between the two sovereign nations of Ireland and the United Kingdom. Maybe even an Anglo-Irish Treaty of 2022, dealing with the modalities of relationships, reaffirming the Belfast Agreement, underpinning the principles of consent, identity and rights, but also ensuring that the ties that bind us, including the common travel area, are affirmed. I would envisage this as being the most boring treaty on the planet. I would like to see it 600 pages long, with every single modality in it that you can think of, because in the boredom, that is the way forward. I would like to see that happen. But it would mean, therefore, that the United Kingdom would recognise in the formal relationship for the EU, there needs to be an established a formal all-islands dimension. And that would work not just for the sake of the people of Northern Ireland, for anybody. So, I've now spoken for more than long enough, but my final thought is that having put the Irish border question back at the centre of the Brexit debate, and that having raised the awareness of our relationship to fever pitch, let us now use the opportunity to move on and take the opportunity now to think more seriously about all of our combined futures. Now, that would be a worthwhile discussion for the day after Brexit. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much, Steve. Thanks for your frankness and your honesty. It's refreshing to hear that. I suggest it's also maybe challenging for us to hear that as well. So on that note, let's open it up to the floor for questions.